Good afternoon, and welcome to Living in the Promised Land, an immigrant rights podcast. This is your host, Mark Schmoily, and again, thanks to producer Stephanie Buatois and to Jeff Barsky, Insect Factory, and Pete Kovitz for the music. So today we have a really special treat. We've got Satsuki Ina, whose book, The Poet and the Silk Girl, just came out last year. It's a memoir of of her parents' life and her very young life as interned during World War II. And we'll get to that in a second. But before we do, I just wanted to give the update of the week, and that is that Mohsen Modawi from, I believe, Vermont, who was released from detention last year. He had been working. He's an academic who'd been working on Palestinian rights issues, but also really peace, getting Jewish students, Palestinian students together. And of course, Rumisa Ozturk, who we talked about extensively and had her attorney, Marty Rosenbluth, on last year, the student from Tufts who was detained for help writing an op-ed asking the university to allow a vote of the students regarding divesting from companies that do sell arms and do business in Israel. So each of them unjustly detained, released, and the two immigration judges who released them have been fired. So this has happened this week, and that's the news item to focus on. And you know what? I mean, as awful as that is, one of the judges, I forgot which one, said that she doesn't know what she's going to do now. And my response is, you're very talented. I have seen them land in good places, and it is right now being an immigration judge is a very, very, very difficult job if you are obeying what you're being told. So it's a very thin tightrope to walk, and unfortunately, most of the good have been fired. So we're reporting that. So without any further ado, Satsuki is a longtime social worker, psychologist, working with victims of trauma, and after doing that for many years, and she wrote this book, The Poet and the Silk Girl. Now, when I say I can't put a book down these days, that's something when you are practicing immigration law and trying to lead life. To most books I'll start and there's that bookmark is left in there and a couple months later, but this one literally kept me up reading. It was so powerful. And I think I've talked about on the show that I did as an undergraduate studying history at the University of Florida. I was one of the first years that there were these microfiches. I'm old, not that old, but there were microfiches out there, and 3 universities sent them to us. And I was reading the newspapers from different internment camps, and again, I'm a very East Coast person. People know I was born in D.C., grew up in New Jersey and Massachusetts, went to school in Florida, and came back up to Maryland. So people say, "Where are you from?" I say, I-95. And so this is all very, very new to me because I hadn't physically had those in my historical town, which was, we had revolutionary history, we've had all of the things, Civil War history, all of that, but none of that to look at, to actually be in those camps and to see them. And so I wanted to do opposition because I wanted to do those who revolted. And I found at the time that there was the Quakers, there was some Methodists, there were very few politicians, and there was J. Edgar Hoover, because he thought that you don't need to intern them, we can surveil them. Why do we need to intern them? So it was more of an intergovernmental fight than anything humane, because it was J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. And so those were the things I learned, and I ended up turning to life inside of the internment camps, and I had a very primitive amount of information to go through, and I was an undergraduate, so I could pour through so many, but I wasn't doing a dissertation on it literally. And since that time, I've seen exhibits where there's been more and more out there. And when I was teaching students from around the country for a Close-Up Foundation, where they bring in high school students from around the country, there was an exhibit at the American History Museum on the internment, and I forgot the focus of it, but it was more of a general exhibit. And this would have been the early 90s, 1990s. And I just had because I knew that 7% of the of U.S. citizens polled opposed the internment. 93% supported it. So I had everybody, I said, who supports internment and who's against internment? And everybody raised their hand. And I said, okay, there were like 30 of them. I said, can 27 of you please put your hands down? And there we go. So this is, and so we know that one of the problems now is this horrific with immigration today is this horrific immigration law, which was passed in 1996, 97-3 in the Senate, based on the idea that after Oklahoma City, after, the people forget Black churches in the South being systematically burned down, there was the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center, and there was a feeling of the Olympics were bombed. I mean, people forget these acts of violence, and by abortion clinics or women's health centers were bombed, and so people felt this fear. And even though almost every one of those was done by a white supremacist militia type folks like Timothy McVeigh, or in the case of Oklahoma City, people who resented the U.S. involvement in the Middle East, Bin Laden, etc. The blame fell on the shoulders of immigrants because they were not able to assimilate and be American and all this stuff. And the irony, the hypocrisy, it was able to be ignored in a sense because we had no foundation. We had no foundation or guts to take on those folks. And we saw after 2020, when the Proud Boys walked 4 years of being investigated, I've had friends who were on those juries, and they just walked. And who is being punished right now? So it's a pattern that continues to perpetuate. And so what makes this book so wonderful, and I'm going to shut up and let Satsuki talk all about it in a minute, but I'm going to just give the things that I loved about the book. First, I'm going to say the reason that it's wonderful in this sense is that the way that in general, and audience out there, I challenge you. I bet that most of us know very little about the internment. I really stopped studying it after that point. I learned, the Korematsu case and all that in law school, but it wasn't a part of my world, and it wasn't like it was when I was, for studying. And so it's not in anybody's high school generally, and so it's something that's ignored. And if anything, people say, well, it was a mistake, but hey, look, they're doing well now. Look at they're doing well and everything is fine. So, we just made a mistake. We're not a perfect country. We'll move forward. And that's what we do. We don't dwell. And when we don't dwell, we also don't have any context. And so it continues to happen again. And that really does come up here. And we talk about, especially your dad's role in the resistance, and his point of view, which I had never seen expressed this articulately, this easily digestible before. I had seen, even when I'd been to exhibits where they would talk about the resistance, it just was incredibly human, told in an amazing way. And I know it was you telling the story in between, but it was really your parents under those conditions they were in to write in a diary. That's a lost art in any population, but it's certainly when people think about, your parents were separated. I mean, it's just, we're not going to have time to go through this whole book, but you've got to read it. It is it is really that good. And so, that's as a book, it's that well written. It's that I loved the fact that you have the diaries, and then you told the history in between in a really complete and digestible way, which is rare. And so it's a great it's just a great book, but it's also challenging, and it's led. So I guess my first question, Satsuki, is um, we know when you were born. So you were born in the early 1940s. In which camp were you born at?
Yeah, I was born in the Tule Lake Segregation Center. It was the maximum security prison.
Okay, and so we know that you've had a long career and you've thought about this a lot. And so why why did you take so long to write the book?
I didn't hear your last
Oh,
question. It cut
I'm
off.
sorry. I'm sorry. So why now? Why now is did you feel compelled to write this book?
Yeah. Um, well, it's been a long journey. I think partly why it took so long is because my community, and including my parents, were very reluctant to talk about their experience. And they experienced a lot of shame for having been prisoners, for being accused of crimes they never committed. And They were, after 4.5 years of incarceration, felt that they had to keep their heads down so they aren't incarcerated again. So they lived with that fear that there was just a small margin of error that was possible that could lead to their loss of freedom again. They lived with that. So, and then part of the reaction to trauma is to avoid re-experiencing the emotions and the memories of that experience. Um, so that's part of it. Also, I think just generally, schools, the classrooms that I went, the classes I had, and teachers I knew, the subject never came up. So I never studied it. In fact, when I was in college at UC Berkeley during the early 60s, um, I got very involved in protesting civil rights for African American communities, and didn't really connect that it was my own community that had also been perpetrated against and suffered consequences of racism and white supremacy. So um, there are a lot of forces to not tell the story or to dig. But I think it happened because my parents, without speaking about it, left documentation. They left their letters that they exchanged while they were in two separate prison camps. My father was a poet. He kept a poetry journal the whole time he was separated from us and incarcerated. And my mother kept a diary. And these uh, memorabilia were apparent to me really at the end of their lives. Um, my father had passed away, and we were cleaning out his desk, and in the back of the bottom drawer was a packet of letters tied with string. And my mother was with me, and I looked at it and I said, "Oh, this looks like letters you sent to Dad." And she was stunned and got very tearful, and I handed them to her, and she looked at them. She said, "Somewhere around here are the letters that he sent to me." So they had both saved the letters that they had received, but they had never talked to each other about it.
Wow.
Yeah, and so I think it was their intention that their story be known to the family. Um, uh, And the interesting part of that moment was that without even taking the string off that was wrapped around it, she handed the packet back to me. Uh, and the next day, I she had uncovered the letters that she had received from my dad. So there was this packet of 182 letters that they had exchanged, and then never said anything else about it. So I carried these letters around. They were partly in Japanese because my parents were both educated in the early years in Japan, although they were both American citizens. Um, and one of the greatest losses that we suffered after our incarceration was the loss of our language. So in my generation, most third generation Japanese Americans are not fluent in Japanese. Uh, but I carried these letters around. I moved several times across the country, um, and felt like there was something that had to be done about it, but um, the right moment hadn't come. And then I was teaching in a graduate program, and there was a Japanese student who was uh, bilingual, understood psychology of trauma, was very attuned to Japanese culture. And so I asked her if she would try out with me translating these letters. And it turned out to be almost a magical experience where she would take the letters out of the envelope and then she could just speak in English as she read these Japanese words. And I had no computer at that time because this was 20 years ago. Um, but I had a word processor. And so I would type up what she was saying. And it was just a powerful experience. To me, she seemed like a magician. She was speaking in my mother's voice and in my father's voice in ways that I had never heard. Um,
Well, so one of the, I mean, you were at Berkeley, and you know, again, as somebody who studied that era, and U.S. civil rights, I know Berkeley was a pioneer college for the free speech movement, and the story that you recount when your professor was encouraging everybody to go and protest for free speech, and you were really proud. You felt so connected to them, and you proudly went home and told your parents, and they were aghast.
yeah,
And that was when, I mean, yeah. So talk about that a little bit. How that.
yeah. So, uh, because my parents, I, I didn't realize as a child, but as an adult looking back on my life with my parents, uh, they lived on the margins of freedom because they never committed a crime. It was because they were Japanese, a person of color, that at any moment they could be scooped up and incarcerated again. So protest was something that they did in camp, in the prison camps. But once they were free, the message to the children from my parents was walk a straight line. You have to continually prove that you're worthy of being an American. You have to keep proving yourself as a loyal American citizen. So when the protests started happening at Berkeley, my parents started calling me every night saying, "We don't want to see your face in the newspaper. We have worked hard to save money so you could go to college. You need to go to class. There's no question about that." And so dutifully, this is the one day that was very meaningful for me. Um, I was walking to class, and all the other students were walking in the opposite direction to go to the free speech that was going to be taking place. And got to my classroom, which usually has like maybe 100 students, and there were three of us in the room. And the professor came running down the aisle, jumped up on top of the desk, turned around, and said, "God damn it, if you show up in class, I'm going to flunk every single one of you." I was like stunned and walked out of the classroom feeling like I was totally caught in this double bind. And that's when my parents said, you need to come home. They were living in San Francisco. And I went home, and this is the moment that the secret that had been in my family all these years was to be talked about. And so my father, who usually left that kind of hard work to my mom, disappeared. And my mother was tearful again. And she said, I need to tell you that during the war, when we were in prison, we renounced our American citizenship, which was shocking news to me. I didn't understand the context, but I did recognize it as a form of protest. And I said, why didn't you tell us about that? And she said, we were afraid you'd be ashamed of us. And I told her, I'm not ashamed. I'm proud of you. And we both sat there and cried for a long time, realizing how little I really understood and knew about my parents' experience in the prison camp. And as a psychologist, began to discover how trauma gets transmitted to generations following the traumatic experience.
Well, and so and again, it's tough. When I was thinking about talking about the book coming on, it's really tough because it's it's a nonfiction. It's not a fiction book. It could be a novel, and I don't. And part of it is you are waiting to see what happens. So I'm not going to, I mean, we know they were here, but I'm just going to say, as I was, my view is, well, what's so important for people to see is there were decisions made. People made different decisions, but within the camp, that there were um, a sizable amount of people that resisted in one way or another, and they were dealt with in one way or another, and they had different relationships with Japan itself. And both of your parents were a little, different story in that they were very connected to Japan and also the United States, and the conditions after the war had to be considered. There was some back and forth. They were separated, and and I want people to read the book because it's not fair to give a summary. This is what happened. I don't want to be the Wikipedia page because it is that good. To find out if it was 500 pages and you had to go through it, I would say, okay, do the summary. But no, it is. It's so I don't want to do that. But I think that's really important. And, it's and people know, and they know why I love Florida, why I cover Alligator Alcatraz so much is because my grandmother's, her two older brothers were in one was in a concentration camp and the other was in the Russian military. And the same silence, the same kind. This is what attracted me to study Japanese internment is that I saw the same responses as the generations went forward. I saw my father not trusting anything in the government. And you know what? He was very conservative, but I also have that distrust of government from him. I have that and he didn't trust that. My grandmother would never speak to a German person. But she wanted to be in when they moved to Miami. When my dad went to college there, and she never wanted to leave. It was quiet. It was a rest, but she didn't want anything to do with. She just wanted a very, very structured, simple life, and her friends, and to just keep it. Her family meant, and she held us all really close in a way that was critical. So I can see some of these sort of similarities, and then you also don't get the story. So I know in my family there was this story that the other brother, when he was killed in fighting for the Soviet army against the Nazis, the area they were in was occupied for a bit, and the Nazis said, "Will you, if you report on your neighbors, we'll save your kids." And they took the decision to assist. And And you talk a lot about one of the people who was a who worked, he was questioning your dad, taking information, and he was from the community, and how it the viewing that person changed for you over time. And I think that these are the kinds of things that happen with these when people are in these situations. It's not it's not black and white. It's not
Right. It's
so
not right or wrong. It
right.
is it's the circumstances. So, just the fact that my parents felt ashamed or were afraid that we would be ashamed that they renounced their American citizenship. But when I studied the whole renunciation experience, they were coerced to give up their citizenship. They were in prison. They didn't know when the war was going to end. They felt that, my mother wrote in her diary, I wonder if today's the day they're going to line us up and shoot us. So she lived with that fear with these two toddlers. My brother was also born in the prison camp. And so when I researched this whole renunciation process, it was the government determined to get rid of the troublemakers. And one way they could do that is to pass this Renunciation Act. And they passed it within weeks. And it was that you could be held here indefinitely, or you could be deported to Japan. And the language, the euphemistic language was used to conceal their effort to actually be rid of anybody who protested. And so, my parents were in two separate prison camps, writing vigorously to each other, trying to figure out what is going to be the best decision for their children. Yeah.
Right. And then sort of they also I think the news was sparse, and then when it became sort of known what Japan looked like, then there was are people living, I mean, it was kind of, as in today's world, it's almost like, are you being deported to Gaza?
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
I mean, that's how I was thinking, as I was looking at it, because you have radiation because of and nobody knew what the future would be.
Right.
And so and family there were saying we can't take care of. So these were these considerations, but also, and again, just to back up a bit, it's like, how did it, at the beginning, like, how did it happen? And really, I think the community was somewhat taken aback. They knew this, the tensions were coming up, but I think they were taken aback and kind of taken by surprise, even though there's not much you could do. And that's sort of what the way that I saw that, through the story of your parents. But, um, you know, one of the things that struck me and kind of resonates with some of the other people we've been interviewing, is that your parents had the neighbor who, I forget her name, but brought them food and checked in on them.
Right.
And your mom recognized it was like the people on the outside care, because that's why it's so important today that what's the my positive movement is that, wow, people in Minneapolis cared. The boy with the bunny hat got released from jail because people cared. All of the uh, people protesting the genocide in Gaza on campuses that are foreign students had support in the communities. People showed up I know here, people showed up in the courthouse, people showed up at their congressmen's offices, and that was not happening.
Right.
To be Japanese internment, it wasn't happening. So, your parents' friend was a pioneer that way, and really alone. I think more your mom was just, her big wonder as she was considering what to do was, do they like us here? Well, are we going to be welcome? Like, I don't want to bring my kids into a place where they're going to be harassed, and so it makes complete sense that the last thing they want to do when they get out is be political,
Right. Exactly.
especially in the 1950s.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, people, and again, this is context, and me with a master's degree in history, I know nothing about the Korean War, and I studied diplomatic history. It's sort of the ignored war because, you know, it's just sort of ignored. Nobody has anything to say. Well, it wasn't a big win, so people forget about it. But the U.S. fought a long time against Koreans and then Vietnamese and Laotians and Cambodians. So
Right.
so all of those wars engendered more bigotry against Asians, to the point of, when I was a kid, I grew up with these words that were these slurs and everything about different, Asians. And so, we didn't fight Europe again. We rebuilt them. We tried to be like them. We tried to be one big community. So, you know, you didn't have, Romanians and Germans and other allies being targeted, but the targeting of Asians continues to today in the United States, because in a lot of ways we continue to have wars against Asian countries and to view them as the enemy. So it was probably really tough, because they saw all of that. So it makes total sense. So I'm going to fast forward a little bit to you today, and you've got a bit of you've done quite a bit to raise the specter of what's going on in the family detention center in Dilley, Texas. You've worked with Native Americans who have the Japanese internment memorial in North Dakota. You've done a lot of work connecting your experience to what's happened in other historical in the U.S. and today, and also with immigration. So you talk a lot about what got you to go to Dilley. So tell us about that.
Sure. So, there was a group of people that were organizing a pilgrimage to Crystal City, Texas, which was the family reunification prison camp after the war ended. And it's Crystal City is in South Texas. And I had this experience where a Japanese American fourth generation young attorney for the ACLU contacted me and in 2018 and said, there these so his grandparents were held in the Tule Lake prison camp where I was held. And so we had had some connection prior to this moment, but he said, these prison camps are proliferating and children are being held there indefinitely. And um, we would like someone to go in with a group of religious leaders who were, well, not necessarily leaders, but who were counseling and providing religious care to the prisoners. They were the only ones that were allowed inside the detention facility. And we'd like you to make some kind of assessment about the trauma that the children are experiencing. So I went in, undercover, essentially, as a uh, religious counsel, even though I don't speak Spanish. So the priest had to sit next to me and do the translation with his back to the guard, so they couldn't tell that I wasn't an authentic bilingual religious counselor there. And I got to interview several mothers and children, and was so disturbed by the level of trauma that I witnessed in the children and the stories that they told me. Um, Horrific stories. The one little girl talked about being very angry with her mother because why did you bring me here? I want to go home. When the mother had um, escaped with her two children to protect them because the gangs had killed their father and threatened to take the children away. And how another kid talked about not being able to eat because they put black pepper all over their food. And when the mothers got together and asked them to stop putting black pepper on the food, the response was, that's so that you won't tell your family members to join you. Um, Water, they couldn't drink the water because the water smelled bad, tasted bad. And it turns out that I saw that the guards all had water bottles hanging off of their belts. And uh, when we walked outside, I asked the priest, I said, what do you think the deal is about the water? And he said, look around. And I said, what is all of that? And he said, these are fracking machines. And so the water that comes into the prison for the prisoners is this water that is uh, infused with the chemicals that are required to dig deep into the earth to get out the minerals that they're looking for. Anyway, it was just a horrible situation. Shortly after that, the people that were organizing a pilgrimage to Crystal City, Japanese Americans have been organizing pilgrimages for several years now, going back to the prison camp sites where they had been held. Um, and I realized that one of these occasions, this prison detaining Central American mothers and children was just 40 miles from the prison camp where I had been as a child. It was the reunification point where we were to be deported to Japan. Um, and so when we had the pilgrimage, you know, people said, if that's the case, we should take the bus and go over and protest in front of the detention site because they're doing to children and families today what they did to us. And so we staged our first protest there.
And what
And
year was that?
that was 2019.
2019, yeah. And 2018, yeah, that was 2018 was when the Kids in Cages was coming up, and it was, um, yeah, and yeah, I mean that's a pretty, it's pretty remarkable because people again, um, it is sort of that bad what you're saying that was happening there, like poisoned water. We see that today. I mean, alligator Alcatraz, as I mean, that's
Right.
doesn't even have water. We've talked about that. People are, we've talked to the witnesses who watch things coming in and out, but they truck in waste, I mean, out wastewater and fresh water in the morning. And whistleblowers who would work there talk about how, you know, these folks are like using buckets as, temporary things. And it's the level of cruelty, and not to mention, the clients that I have in there, that I've had in there, the people I've talked to mostly, and I talk about this on the show, is it's more my job now is to sort of do wellness checks on them when I can get calls in and trying to get them out, because the death total is already up to, I think, 42 this year, which is incredible. Because but they also, they you detain somebody who's a diabetic and you don't have their insulin, they're going to go into shock and die. And that's what happens. And these are the realities of what's happening there. And so people will then, so the trick is, how do we make, how do we make this, I mean, what do we see as making this, again, for the 1500th time, worthwhile? Like, how do we make the change so that these things don't continue to happen? And the theory on this show is, my theory is that we really do have to elevate, the discourse, not to the point of, because some of it is knowledge and some of it is ignoring. But I think, and I always say this about the United States, is that, you know, it's fungible. Like, people aren't, I know this from the people that I know that support Trump. or supported him or voted for him or what have you is, and even not just supporting Trump, even like people who, you know, I mean, all the people that voted for Kamala and said, don't talk about genocide, don't talk about transgender people, don't talk about immigrants, because those aren't good issues. Don't talk about gun control. Don't talk about the things that make the society safe, because we've lost on that. We have to pretend we're like them. And we have to, and so once you cross that Rubicon, you then say, okay, well, I can do it. If you're George Bush or somebody, I can do it a lot without any equivocation, really, maybe a little niceties. And then you also invite, under certain circumstances, people who don't care, the non-empathetic radicals who say, okay, well, you all said immigrants are, too much immigration is bad. You've all said, you don't support, crime is tough. We need to be tougher. So I'm not playing games. I'm just getting rid of them. And that's what people want. And they do it to a point where it becomes horrific to most people. But the concern is when it's out of the news, people think it's not happening. And so the trick is we need to get people to change the paradigm and realize that, you know, the realize that without a paradigm, without a real change, you're not getting rid of the king. You're just taking the crown off, and and so I just wanted your thoughts on what you think, or the positive parts too, but what you see as any changes, or where you see the landscape, and what you think kind of needs to be done.
Well, I think you use the word that I like to focus on is about caring. It's a simple word and everyday action, but part of the work after I realized and my community realized uh, that this atrocity was happening again. Um, we had to get people to care about it. And so Japanese Americans quickly could identify with what was happening uh, today. And so, we formed an organization that reached out to Japanese Americans who were descendants and survivors to show up with us, to physically show up to protest and demonstrate the caring. Um, so I want to just go back a little bit to the story that you referred to when my mother was held in the first prison camp. She was pregnant with my brother, and the she described how she could stand inside the chain link fence that had the barbed wire across the top of it and see on a Sunday people taking their Sunday walks, pushing their babies in baby carriages, kids playing ball and things like that through the chain link fence. Well, on their side, they were dealing with surveillance and restrictions and uh, um, fear of the unknown. They had no idea. A form of torture is to not tell a person how long they're going to be penalized. And so this group of women, who I later discovered were American Friends Service Committee women, Quakers, would come on Sundays and stand on the other side of the fence and heave over fruits and vegetables to the mothers that would come there. And, that meant a lot to my mom, but especially one day, a woman came. She had a cotton quilt blanket, and she called over to my mother, maybe noticing that she was pregnant, called her over closer to the fence. And this woman managed to heave over the top of the fence this handmade, beautiful quilt, cotton quilt. And she said to my mother, she said, I hope this helps. And so many, many years later, when my mother was ill and failing, she, she had that blanket on her bed. And I said, let's get you a new blanket. This is kind of raggedy. And I knew the story. She had told me the story, but uh, she grabbed the blanket and she said, no, this blanket stays here. And I said, what does it mean for you? And she said, this blanket always reminds me that somebody outside cared. And that has been an underlying theme for me in writing the book, in the activism that we're now engaged in, is to humanize what is a powerful dehumanizing
Yes.
project, program, policy, practice. And For Japanese Americans, it doesn't take much to connect with our own experience to realize how there's so much that is resonant and unconstitutional and inhumane. So I think, I wrote that book because I wanted people to care. I wanted people to just know a human story. My parents were pretty much ordinary people faced with extraordinary circumstances. And I am the beneficiary of their courage and the decisions they made, fraught with unknowing about what is actually going to happen to them. So I think, um, you know, the simple act of folding a paper crane became a way in which we reached out to our community and then people outside of our community. We thought that when we showed up to demonstrate, we wanted the children inside the prison to be able to see outside and see that people cared. And so someone said, well, we need to have bright colors then because it's a good distance between the fence and where they're held inside the buildings. So someone said, okay, well, let's fold paper cranes. We'll hang paper cranes all along the fencing. And I said, yeah, that's great. We need to fold 1,000 cranes. And then Mike Ishii, who is the head lead of the Tsudu for Solidarity, our organization now, said, no, we need 10,000 paper cranes.
What is the organization?
Tsudu for Solidarity.
Okay, we'll put that in the notes if people want to.
Tsudu, TSURU means is the origami paper cranes.
Okay.
And
solidarity. No, okay.
for Solidarity.
I didn't know that was the word for it. Okay.
So we are a nonprofit, nonviolent social justice organization that arose from the realization that this was happening again. And so survivors, led by survivors, the press likes old people protesting.
Yes.
And so when we showed up with our walkers and our hearing aids and our canes, we were able to draw press, which is really important because that's another element of getting people to care. They need to have the information.
Yes.
So, and we wanted to also, we didn't realize this at the time, but we also wanted to make noise so that they could hear us outside. So we brought our taiko drummers, our Japanese American taiko drummers.
Beautiful.
Yes, and this remarkable thing happened. There are several hundred of us standing in front of these detention sites, and in Oklahoma, Fort Sill, the threat of being arrested was always there, but as we chanted and sang and protested, our posters, all of those things, there was a healing that started to take place for us. We felt finally empowered to protest a situation that we had suffered ourselves, and we're not going to deal with being silent like others were when we were incarcerated. So our protest is based on caring and therefore healing and repair and reaching out across to other communities of color that are being targeted and standing with them to tell our stories so that people can get the history of how this pattern of targeting and mass incarceration removal is something that has been a part of American history from the beginning.
Yeah, and last year, the one time before, we will go on the road. By the way, we're going to Alligator Alcatraz. Hopefully, I've got my plans this time. I think we're going to head. But I was in Springfield, Ohio last year, and interviewed the head of the Haitian Community Center there, and then went around town and just talked to people, and what they've done to that town to 10 years, the Haitian population has been there. There's 20,000, and they're trying, this is when you begin to put your roots in. And the younger people were just beside themselves by how much their elders were often, trying to preserve what was really a dead town at the time. And, just not even the economic part of it and all of that, but just to kick this community out. And there really was this war within the town. And I can tell you at that time, J.D. Vance took a personal role in it. He's from Middleton, the next town over. And people said he knew what he was doing when he threw that bomb out, that he said that his Senate office got the calls about the dogs and the et cetera. And,
Right.
and the people on the city council were being threatened. They had to close people didn't talk about that. The neo-Nazis and the Klan were marching through the town, that people felt threatened.
Right.
And that's everybody. And so, one of the things when I taught at Maryland in immigration and ethnicity is I had people do a case study of different areas where refugees are resettled in Ohio, these different rural areas, and how the local community responds. And, like it or not, these communities or immigrants will move where there's jobs, where there's communities, no matter where it is, and so you're going to have communities in places, and we talked about Truckee, California, a couple weeks ago or last month, and how the Chinese laborers were sort of they're an asterisk. There's not a community because they were driven out, and the Haitian community is settled there, and they're strong, and they're part of it. And so it's the precipice that if you all of a sudden put them out of status, all of a sudden get them, you could have a mass removal. And that's
Right.
kind of what the Japanese internment was. There had been that many years of settling people there and doing economically well, that they uproot the whole economy, which is even more of a settled. And so these are, the patterns continue to go, and it doesn't matter. I mean, we can talk about Trump all we want, but it was probably the most liberal president we've ever had, who interned your family. So
Right.
it was not. So these are fears that come in, and it's really crucial. And we see, and it really is a matter of empathy. And I mean, I know people, okay, they may not be ready for the political paradigm we're talking, but I know in my community here, we had this, are we going to support politically the community and all that? And one of the people said, we don't take stands. He's a Republican guy, but he's also a teacher and a generous guy and very, religious. And I said to him, hey, would you tutor a student after school whose mom was deported or something? These kids, or would you tutor them? Would you get them pencils? Would you help them with their math?
Yeah. Right.
So that's with the beginning, and the gestures you're talking about. Would you make a blanket for somebody? Would you bring them food? Would you understand
Right.
their humanity? And that's the first step. And Trump and company are betting no. They're betting that no. And there's a lot of history on their side,
Yeah.
right? I mean, there's a lot of history on their side, 93%, you know? So all it takes, in a community is any sort of, what it took in Ohio was a Haitian man who ran a red light and hit a school bus, and a 10-year-old flew out and was killed. And that's all it
Right.
took to say, get all 20,000 out. And you know what? You can say, geez, whenever we see a shooting, is it, we hope it's not an immigrant, but you know what? It might be. It doesn't mean it's system, we can't walk on eggshells. We can't worry that nobody in the community is going to do something. It's just, that's not real. That's not real. And it's also oppressive. So
Right.
that's, well, I always end, Satsuki, I always end on, or I try to end on something that makes us optimistic for the week. And, I'm going to continue to remain optimistic that people are still rising up. People are still protesting. I mean, Minneapolis was the highlight, but people are protesting. They are making some changes. They're asking their politicians. God bless our USA Pope. He's
Right.
the Catholic Church is not backing down, and
Right.
so there's a lot of solidarity and there's a lot of pushback, I think, in the right place. That's where I'm gonna uh, I'm gonna say is sort of my optimism. But what makes you optimistic?
I think along the same lines, I feel like um, people are showing up in numbers. And I think mass mobilization is a demonstration to those in power that, there are millions of us that are protesting and we are showing up and naming and labeling what it is we are opposed to and providing support for those who are being targeted. And the other thing too is I feel like working across communities so that we are in solidarity with each other uh, is gives me a lot of hope that we are crossing uh, boundaries that have been placed there to keep us from connecting with each other, to be in conflict and in competition with each other. So working across communities um, is gives me a lot of hope as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and I also think that we don't have we don't have the choice but to bet on our neighbors.
Yeah.
And so don't I think people I think there needs to be a lot of internal work for us. Like, what are we? Because yeah, there's part of it that's just viscerally sickening. But I hear from people, oh, it's too much, it's overwhelming, and it doesn't have to be as you start in the community. So yeah, I agree. And by the way, I don't want to have glare on it. I'm not good at this, but here's the book, The Poet. It's your mom and the Silk Girl. And I mean, your dad's the poet, your mom's the Silk Girl, obviously. And just a remarkable, I mean, even if you're not political, it's incredible. Even if you're not thinking about the book in any political way, you're like, wow, they managed to stay together. They managed to, and they stay married afterward. And they managed, I mean, you could see the difference in just general. It reminded me of my parents in some ways because my mom was very gregarious and my dad was just, quiet. And he's an engineer, very quiet, did things, had his ideas, but would remain silent when it wasn't there. And how, like, the long silence, like when your dad would write these short things and your mom would, just the relationship was pretty incredible. And how they each thought about you, how they thought in parallel ways about the best thing for you guys, for you and your brother. And they weren't always on the same page, but they respected what they were saying.
Yeah. Right.
Probably more so than they might have respected, especially your dad, what other people were saying.
Right. Exactly.
It was, you really got to know them, and it's just just a remarkable book.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much I really appreciate your words. I appreciate being invited to be on this podcast with you. Appreciate you for doing the work that you're doing. It's so important to educate people and create the context that you're providing for people. Um, this is this is the kind of moment that gives me hope. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate it, and you too. And also, look, we need to fight the injustice. I mean, we need to fight the injustice. We need to do what we need to do to get out there and speak for people who really it's hard for them to speak. So, Satsuki, thank you so much. And we will talk soon.
Okay. Thank you,
All right, thank
Mark.
you. All right, bye bye.